What's up guys, CEO here with a video that is unscripted and thus probably going to be all over the place. I'm here to do the Season 2 recap that I told you all that I was going to do, and I'm actually doing it for the first time, which is interesting. So I really wanted to make this video so I could kind of have like a post-season analysis on the Pokemon that I liked and the Pokemon that I didn't really like as much as I was hoping to. Both to help myself know what I want to draft in the future and to kind of give you guys a little bit of analysis on, I guess, how I like the stuff. So I'll go ahead and start off. I don't know how long this video is going to be, by the way, but I'll go ahead and start off with the Pokemon that made it from my roster from draft to the finish of the end of the season, both because I feel like I have the most experience with those Pokemon and because they're the ones that I drafted. So starting off, Skarmory in, I forget actually what rounds I drafted stuff, so I'm not going to say that, but Skarmory was my tier 1, and honestly I was very happy with Skarmory as my tier 1. I wasn't sure how I was going to feel about getting a more defensive top tier option, but I knew going into the draft that Skarmory was something that potentially fit my playstyle pretty well, even though I'm normally an offensive player. Having both hazards on the same Pokemon was actually fantastic, as well as having a reliable defog option and something that frankly just kind of hard-walled a surprising amount of teams. I feel like the main times it didn't do what I wanted it to do, it was more my fault than its fault, I guess. Either both times I tried to bring weak armor, which I'm still convinced is a thing that can work, but did not work anytime I tried to bring it. And anytime I just kind of left it in when I shouldn't have. There was one play specifically against Fluka where I roosted, got rid of my flying typing, and then got obliterated by a sock, which I wasn't very happy about. But for the most part, Skarmory pretty much did everything I wanted it to do. It really kind of exceeded my expectations, I would say. And overall, I would definitely draft it again, even though it's a tier 1. Cresselia at tier 2, I'm going to be honest, I did not vibe as well with. Like, I see the appeal for Cresselia. I see that it's a tank that can honestly, like, at +1, like, do way more than it probably should be able to do. But my personal problem with it in leagues, and I've actually heard it from other coaches, but I kind of just needed to experience it for myself, is that it's, first of all, too passive unless you're specifically making it offensive. And with the fact that it's passive, but still such a passive threat, it is game planned for every single week. Like, you will not have a week where your opponent doesn't bring a ton of shit to handle Cresselia, which you can actually use to your advantage for team building. Towards the end of the year, I kind of used Cresselia as more of a decoy, honestly, than actually bringing it. Obviously, you can't do that for too long because then coaches just figure you don't like the Pokemon. And while I liked Cresselia's options for coverage and stuff, it just never really seemed to do quite enough for me. The only week I felt like it really held its own was week 3 against MDS, where it basically just hardwalled that Gramble to fucking back. But honestly, like, every time I brought Cresselia outside of that, I think I lost, actually. This is probably just a case of me being uncomfortable with a passive Pokemon that is really good. Like, Cresselia's base stat total is amazing, especially for a tier 2. And after a Claw Mind, it is, like, very difficult to take down. But it just wasn't really working for me. I don't know if I would draft it again. I'm not really going to shit on it for anyone that does draft it, because I can definitely see the appeal, but it just didn't really work out for me as much as I wanted. Next up, we have my boy Nidoking, who went a name change in the final game of the season from Fluorite to Marquette, because I'm the Mud Raiders now, and it took me until the last game of the season to realize that there was someone on the Raiders named Marquette King. I don't know how I forgot Marquette, but, you know, whatever. So, Nidoking is, and still was, and will always probably be one of my favorite Pokemon because it can just do so much. I am actually proud to say that I potentially got Nidoking moved up to tier 2 for next season. I'm going to be perfectly honest, I would still draft it there. I don't know if I'm going to, because I don't know if it's going to fit my team, but the fact that it's so offensive and can run Scarf and be just unbelievable wall breaker with a Life Orb really makes it hard to plan for. when I drafted Nidoking back in Season 1, there were a lot of people that swore up and down that Nidoqueen was the better one. And while I do agree that Nidoqueen can probably run defensive sets and like Stealth Rock, Toxic Spike sets a little bit better, Nidoking, in my opinion, is probably better in leagues just because it has offense on both sides if you play it right that is kind of unstoppable some games. The only thing that reliably outspeeds it is a fast Psychic type, which you can hit with Sucker Punch, or a fast like Water type or something to hit the ground that isn't immune by poison. Like Poison Ground is surprisingly good coverage that also allows it to switch into Toxics and Thunder Waves, which is very, very underrated. And overall, even though I didn't really play Nidoking as well this season as I did in Season 1 where it got like 13 kills or something like that, this thing is absolutely top tier wall breaker. One of my favorite Pokemon, like I've said a million times. Offensively, physically, and specially, it's awesome. This thing just has like unfair coverage. It's not really very much for setup, but you don't really need it to be when basically everything on its roster gets benefited by Sheer Force Life Orb, because that just is completely busted. And 85 speed is actually better than a lot of people give it credit for. It's still slower than most top tier wall breakers that are like more around the base 95 or 100, but as Choice Scarf Nidoking is honestly going to outspeed a lot of stuff that's not scarfed or boosted, so just take that how you will, I guess. Next up is a Pokemon that I did not know anything about before the season and then probably became my favorite member on the team. I have a lot of favorite members on the team, so it's a little bit hard for me to say that, but Zoroark ended up coming in clutch every single time I brought it. Probably the best play of the season that I had personally was the double in the playoffs against Dowsy that ended up catching the Slowbro and OHKOing it from full. That was probably the play like I'm most proud of probably in my league career, honestly. I feel like I'm a kind of risky player a lot of the time, but that was the first time where I've made a play that I knew I needed to make, and I just happened to make it, so that was cool. But Zoroark, even I'll get to Illusion later, but just like based on its stats and its distribution, it's just bulky enough to be able to take one hit from most things, and then can pretty much hit back like Nidoking on both sides, with pretty good power. Like it's above average in both attack and special attack, which I feel like a lot of people don't know. It has setup on both sides. Even though I didn't use setup on both sides, it was still a threat. I actually did, spoilers, try to bring a Nasty Plot set one week, but it was the week I played JTN and he ended up forfeiting from me. I was actually pretty sad because Zoroark in practice reliably got like 3 or 4 kills every game, but that's okay. There's just so many different things that Zoroark can do that I feel like I barely kind of scratched the surface with it, and that's not even counting Illusion being one of the coolest abilities in Pokemon. I think towards the end of the year I really started to play along with the like intense mind games that actually go along with Zoroark, mainly by like intentionally breaking its disguise and then redisguising it as something else so my opponent thinks that the disguise is just like permanently broken, but it's not. Even when opponents were like very heavily prepared for Zoroark, I just noticed that over the course of a game you eventually lose track. Like unless you're specifically sitting there like every single play, you just eventually lose track of Zoroark. And it happens a lot when you play fast, but it also happens even when you're slow. And honestly, even if you know that it's a Zoroark, there's sometimes you just can't really do anything about it, because 120 special attack is actually pretty decent. Especially with 105 speed, which allows it to like pretty comfortably outspeed most base hundreds. You still have to run Timid if you want to like guaranteed outspeed base hundreds that are at +1, which kind of stinks with the Choice Scarf. But otherwise it's fine. Overall, definitely would draft Zoroark again, and am potentially going to franchise it. Slight spoilers. Next up is the other thing that I'm potentially thinking about franchising, because this thing far and away exceeded every expectation I had for a tier 5 wall. I thought Volt Absorb and Water Absorb were really cool in one Pokemon, but what I did not know is that Lantern has such cool support that it ended up being like a very critical member of my party almost every single week. And honestly, most of the weeks I didn't bring it, it was because I just didn't want to bring it every single week. But Water Electric is fantastic typing. When I was going into the draft, I actually looked pretty heavily at Rotom Wash, but I ended up going for Skarmory in that pick, and then Rotom Wash was sniped on the wheel after that. So I knew Water Electric was pretty interesting typing, but what I didn't know is that it didn't really need Levitate to be interesting typing. Like I was able to use Water Electric very well as a defensive typing and just pivot around with Volt Switches. Hit surprisingly hard with Hydro Pump. I again had a bunch of practice games against JTN that didn't end up coming through, but I actually brought Waterium Z Hydro Pump against him, and then a Fast Lantern to outspeed and OHKO most like defensive or like stealth rocky Mamoswine sets. And if it was offensive, I could still live because of Lantern's like ridiculous HP. I don't know why this thing was a tier 5, but it's now been moved up to a tier 4 because Antone from Season 1 showed that it does not deserve to be a tier 5. And especially with Z moves, being able to give it a reliable recovery is pretty broken. And overall, definitely would draft Lantern again. And like I said, it's one of the Pokemon I'm considering franchising because it's just very good value for what it does. And despite its lower stats, like it still actually hits hard enough when you want it to that it isn't really passive, in my opinion. Next up, we have my first round pick and the Pokemon that I knew I was going to like going into the season, but far exceeded my expectations. I could have probably gotten Lopunny to be the kill leader, if I'm being perfectly honest. Or at least gotten it into the top 2 if I would have brought it every single week, but I wanted to show both myself and other coaches that I wasn't totally reliant on it. Turns out that Lopunny was like critical in every single game that I won and would have been helpful in most of the games that I lost, so I probably should have just brought it every week with how good it is, but I kind of wanted to mix it up with my team building. 136 attack and 135 speed is very hard to work around, especially when you have stuff like Fake Out and Quick Attack that are both stab for Lopunny, and an ability in Scrappy that just literally makes it have perfect neutral coverage whenever you want it to. A lot of people with Lopunny, when they see this Pokemon, they just slap High Jump Kick on it and then call it a day. I knew most coaches would be planning for that, so I tried to use a bunch of different sets with Lopunny, and I feel like I was able to vary it up pretty well from week to week. I used a couple of support Lopunnies towards the end of the season just to mess around, but this thing is a top tier wall breaker. Absolutely a tier 1 mega, possibly more than that in my opinion. Just because 135 attack, 136 speed, stab Fake Out, stab Quick Attack, and then just being able to outspeed the rest of basically the game. Like there's very few things that can actually naturally outspeed base 135. And I don't know, when you're able to outrun Crobat and Jolteon and still like give yourself extra HP, you know a Pokemon's fast. But the fact that this thing hits as hard as it does, and then also gets Stab Facade, by the way. I don't know if I ever actually brought Stab Facade and actually got to use like the full base 140 version of it, but alright, so next up we have Druddigon, who I actually only brought a couple of weeks and liked, but it always seemed to kind of underwhelm in practice, so it always kind of got lapped by other stuff, to be perfectly honest. I do think Druddigon's a good Pokemon for its tier. It's tier 4, and I think it's probably worth tier 4. Stealth Rock, Glare is a cool like defensive support set with Rough Skin. It can also be very offensive if slow. With Sheer Force and Mold Breaker, which was nice. I think I brought Mold Breaker a couple of times, but Mold Breaker is a cool ability and helps with Druddigon's moveset. And it has good typing, it's just, I don't know, like, I always wanted Druddigon to just do more than it did. As a tier 4, I think it's a fair pick because it does have good physical coverage. It does get Stealth Rock, it does get Glare, which is a really underrated move in my opinion. Especially now that Thunder Wave got nerfed a little bit, having a perfectly accurate paralysis move that can also paralyze ground types is really cool. But outside of that, its moveset's just a lot of physical stuff. But since it's so slow, like, you can normally just get a burn off on it, and then it doesn't really do very much, and it can't really, like, it has okay bulk, but it doesn't have recovery, and it's not good enough bulk to be like, wow, this thing's really fat. So it kind of just gets caught in between a lot of roles, in my opinion. Good value for a tier 4, and if you don't have a dragon and you need a tier 4 dragon specifically, I don't really think there's any other option that you have. And it's better than the dragons that are below it in tier 5. So at its tier, it's good, but there are definitely better dragons that you can get. Sort of similarly, I think Sylveon got kind of a little bit more of a nerf than I was giving it credit for. While Pixelate specifically isn't really, like, Pixelate got nerfed from Gen 6 to Gen 7, and instead of doing 1.3 times the damage, it does 1.2 times the damage. That specifically I don't think was that big of a nerf, because Hyper Voice was still completely wrecking shit. But outside of that, I think just the fact that the metagame got skewed a lot more towards taking out fairies kind of made Sylveon's pure fairy typing not as good, in my opinion. Sylveon had a benefit in Gen 6 for being one of the few, like, pure fairies that were actually good. But now that there's a lot of anti-fairy offense now, thanks to Gen 7, pure fairy is not really as strong anymore, in my opinion. And much like Vaporeon, Sylveon's moveset isn't really very good, actually. Well, let me rephrase. Sylveon has a couple of movesets that are very, very good, but in League play, it doesn't have as much versatility as you might expect it to. Like, it's basically always going to be either Spidef or offensive, and there's not really very, like, you can kind of run, like, cleric-y sets and stuff, too, but if you do that, it just gets killed pretty quickly, because while it... Like, base 130 Spidef is pretty nice, and base 95 HP is enough that it can be pretty bulky. I don't know. Its ability not being as defensive made it a little bit harder for me to use Sylveon than it did to use Vaporeon in Season 1, in my opinion. And while I did really, really like offensive Sylveon and basically ran it every single time I ran Sylveon, I think, I don't think it was, like, as good of an offense as it should have been for a tier 1, I guess. Like, Pixelate Hyper Voice does a lot, and I actually managed to get, like, 3 kills with a Calm Mind sweep against Super Nerd, I think. So, like, it does do stuff offensively, and is a good fairy for that, I guess. But I don't think it was worth tier 1. It fit my team well, and I did like it, and I would probably draft it again if it was a lower tier, and it does look like it maybe it moved to tier 2 based on how shitty I played it this season. But I think it actually fits there. It's not a very good Z move user either. I know I've only kind of, like, casually brought that up, but I did try to run Z moves on it a couple of times and was just kind of underwhelmed. And while wish passing is kind of nice with it, it's not as easy as it is to do with Vaporeon, in my opinion, because at least you can come in on a water type, completely wall it most of the time, and then just get a wish up. There aren't very many opportunities for you to do that with Sylveon, like, unless you catch something locked into Outrage or something. So now I'm going to go over the free agent picks as I talk about the last 6 Pokemon. So I'm going to go ahead and go over things just in the order that I have them here, because this is the way I thought out the season. I'm going to go and start off with Combuskin because I believe it's a decent speed boost passer, even though it only came once and it didn't actually get to pass anything. It kind of ended up getting walled by Salamence just because I didn't bring HP Ice on it over Rock Slide, even though Rock Slide still did a decent amount, or with an Intimidate, I guess. But anyway, even though it didn't actually get to pass any speed, I think Combuskin is just bulky enough that it can potentially live stuff within a Violite that you wouldn't expect it to, and pass stuff off if you end up being more speed invested than someone expects. Those are very specific circumstances, but that's the reason why this is a tier 5 speed boost passer and not a, like, tier 1 speed boost passer. I don't know. I still believe in Combuskin. I almost said Scolipede because I was thinking of tier 1 speed boost passers. I still believe in Combuskin because it's a good value pick, and there's not really a lot of things that can valuably speed boost pass if that's allowed in your league. It is in ours because I think it's a little bit more fair in league play than it is in standard ladder play, in my opinion, because at least you can see it coming and prepare for it. But I didn't end up keeping Combuskin, obviously. Later into the season, I saw that Darmanitan was still just sitting there. And I ended up making a double swap with Combuskin and Galvantula for Darmanitan and Cryogonal. Essentially, Combuskin was getting swapped for Darmanitan because I wanted a tier 5, or I wanted my tier of fire, I guess, to be a little bit better. I worded that poorly, but whatever. Sheer Force, Flare Blitz, frankly, if you have a Life Orb, has not very many switch-ins. I don't know why I can't speak anymore, but just roll with me, please. Sheer Force, Life Orb, as I talked about with Nidoking, and a little bit potentially with Druddigon. I don't remember if I actually mentioned it, but it had Sheer Force too. But with Darmanitan being the fastest of all of them, and as well as having the most attack and actually having decent attacks to work with it, it ends up just doing a ton. I think most of the times I brought it, it was actually Scarf this season just because I didn't really need it as more than a Scarfer. But if I would have brought it more often, I could have definitely used it as a Life Orb. I did actually try to bring Sheer Force sub Salicberry Belly Drum set the last week of the season because it did something in practice, but it didn't do anything in the regular game. But that was the only time Darmanitan's actually died all season. I did a pretty good job of keeping it clean because I basically just needed to come in, punch a hole, and then leave. And having it as almost an exclusive Scarfer allowed it to outspeed a lot of stuff that I don't think coaches were necessarily expecting. And again, Sheer Force Flare Blitz is awesome because it basically just removes the 10% chance to burn and gives you even more power on such a powerful move, which is fantastic. Next up is Galvantula, which is a Pokemon that I didn't actually want to drop at all. The only way I could get Darmanitan though is if I dropped it, so I kind of had to suck it up. But even though I dropped Galvantula early and didn't really get to use it as much more than a Sticky Web user, I do think it has place in leagues, obviously. It has a pretty interesting speed tier. Compound Eyes makes it so it can actually afford to use like its a little bit more inaccurate moves like Thunder to kind of boost its otherwise not great special attack. Sticky Webs are obviously fantastic. I kind of overrated how good they might be though, because there's a lot of stuff that's levitating and flying that is a little bit more threatening than I gave it credit for. Such as the Lotties, which completely destroyed this roster. Galvantula ended up being pretty decent for me. I feel like if I would have kept it for a little bit longer than I did this season, I could have probably used it pretty well. It has an interesting move pool. It actually has a pretty interesting physical move pool, even though you wouldn't really get to use it too often. I did try to bring Sucker Punch once or twice, just because having priority on Galvantula is kind of nice and a little bit surprising. Its move pool is a little limited, which I guess is one of the main things that I don't love about it. Unless you really need electric bug typing specifically, it's a little limited, and even then you might be a little bit better off going after Vikavolt, just because it seems like it might be a little bit more versatile in what it wants to do. But this is probably one of the better Sticky Webbers you're going to get. And this is probably one of the few Pokemon that actually has Bug Electric typing, as well as the ability Compound Eyes and Unnerve, which is a little underrated to get rid of berries and stuff. So overall, I would probably draft Galvantula again. I would also probably draft Combuskin and Darmanitan again, interestingly enough. Combuskin would have to be in the similar situation it was this season, where I needed a tier 5 fire type specifically, so it's a little niche and I wouldn't really go after it otherwise. Darmanitan was interesting enough physically that I feel like I could marry it up. It kind of made my team skewed a little too heavily physically in my opinion, which was kind of a drawback that I didn't really see at the time of picking it up. especially after I dropped Galvantula. But that's okay, I guess. That's a team building or team roster building mistake that I won't make in the future. But by dropping Galvantula, it allowed me to pick up Cryogonal, who secretly ended up kind of being awesome, actually. I wasn't sure how I was going to feel about having an ice type on my roster at all, because honestly I'm not really one to use stab ice a lot of the time. But Cryogonal was surprisingly bulky, actually, on the special side. Ended up being able to take a Soldu Draco Meteor from Melody and just recover up after, which is kind of cool. Recover and set up screens in its face, which is kind of nice. Its speed tier is also really nice, even though it was a little redundant on my specific team because I also had Zoroark. And getting the HP boost this season actually made it bulky enough to be like somewhat bulky. And defense is not like complete ass anymore, so it can actually take somewhat of a hit on that side if it has to. Outside of that, its special move pool is a little limited in my opinion. But it tends to kind of hit what you need it to hit. I can't really complain about its special move pool being limited when this thing got me 4 kills one week. I actually nominated it for Heat of the Season because of that, because you don't really see Cryogonal getting 4 kills in any game ever. But outside of that, I was very, very happy with Cryogonal. Absolutely would draft this thing again. I ended up drafting it specifically because it's a rapid spinner, and I don't even remember if it actually ended up spinning away any hazards, but everything else about it ended up being really cool. Next up we have Dhelmise, which is a Pokemon that I was really excited for when I drafted it, specifically because of Anchor Shot, and then it just kind of underwhelmed every single week I tried to bring it. It's really slow. It has okay bulk. It hits really, really hard, but unless you're under Trick Room, it's not really going to hit that hard. I did get to experience the thing under Trick Room for a little bit, and it did kind of put in a little bit more work then. So if you have a Trick Room heavy team, this thing's actually probably pretty good because its stats are otherwise very, very impressive. But outside of Trick Room, it just doesn't really seem to hit very hard. Ghost, Grass, and Steel is a really weird offensive like typing trio, I guess is the easiest way to put that. But with Steel Worker you get 1.5 off of your Steel type attack, so you basically get stab off of that without having to be a Steel type. Ghost Grass is a weird defensive typing though. I kinda just wish this thing would have been like Grass Ghost and then had an ability that gave its Ghost type attacks 1.5. Because Grass Steel is a lot better of a defensive typing than Ghost Grass is. But overall, honestly, Dhelmise is probably one of the Pokemon on my draft that I would not draft again, in my opinion. I mainly got it as a Rapid Spin / Rapid Spin blocker, and for potential Ghost shenanigans, but it doesn't even really get a lot of the support moves that a lot of Ghosts would get. Like, it's just very, very offensive with a typing that doesn't really help it that much, in my opinion. I do feel like I could have probably used Anchor Shot a little bit better than I did. But I just wasn't really feeling Dhelmise that much, if I'm being perfectly honest. So, late in the season, after Fluka dropped Cofagrigus, I ended up picking it up because I know that I like Cofagrigus. Stat-wise, it's not actually that different from well, okay, let me rephrase. I wasn't expecting to go into this season having 2 Pokemon with over base 140 defense, and Cofagrigus and Skarmory. But being able to have both of those actually allowed me to kind of play around with both a little bit more, because I was able to basically use their base defense as like a nice natural starting point rather than having to invest into it and stuff. So it allowed me to kind of play around with Trick Room Nasty Plot sets with Cofagrigus a lot more, giving me another special attacker, which I kind of needed, as well as one that actually had pretty decent coverage across the board. And even though I didn't really get to use it that long because I only had it for the last like 2 or 3 weeks of the season, I absolutely would draft this thing again because it has all of the Ghost moves that you want with a Ghost type. It has the defense that frankly is very, very surprising for something of this bulk. It has recovery even if it's not that reliable, and Pain Split. It has Will-O-Wisp, and Mummy is a really cool ability that actually kind of gives it a unique niche in Pokemon, being the only Pokemon that can actually get rid of other abilities by contact. it's kind of an interesting way, and I feel like there's kind of untapped potential with Mummy being able to like spread throughout a team and stuff like that. But I haven't actually seen it quite yet, so overall I would draft Packagus again, and I would say all things considered, being able to draft 10 of my 11 Pokemon that I drafted and then every single free agent overall means that this is probably a successful season. Again, I'm bummed I didn't win. I would have liked to have come back against Dowsy and kind of storm my way through the playoffs, but I'll just save that for next season, I guess. I'm nice and hungry for that, so that's good. If you missed the end